Star Trek Generations is directed by David Carson, written by Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga, and stars Patrick Stewart, Jonathan Frakes, Brent Spiner, LeVar Burton, Michael Dorn, Gates McFadden, Marina Sirtis, Whoopi Goldberg, and William Shatner and Malcolm McDowell. And in Star Trek Generations, Captain Jean-Luc Picard and the crew of the USS Enterprise-D pursue a crazed Elorian scientist called Soran, played by Malcolm McDowell, who has been destroying entire solar systems. Now, before I say anything in this review, I have to mention that I've never seen a single episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. I know, I plan to soon, but this was really my first experience with the TNG characters. And Star Trek Generations is a technically very impressive movie, and the TNG cast is really solid, but it's just often kind of dull all throughout the movie. Now, I love the original series in all its cheesiness, but it's just so refreshing to see the updated effects of The Next Generation. You know, the phasers actually feel like deadly weapons this time. The starships are really mesmerizing to see in space, and they have actual shields this time. The makeup work is still solid, and John A. Alonzo's cinematography uses darkness in really interesting ways. And most of the actors in this movie are actually really good. Whoopi Goldberg was a lot more dramatic than I was expecting her to be. Jonathan Frakes and Michael Dorn are just instantly likable, which is really good because I didn't feel alienated by them. And thank God that Brent Spiner has a better role in Star Trek than he does in Independence Day. And as someone who really loves Captain Kirk, I really like Captain Jean-Luc Picard as well, played by Patrick Stewart. He's very strict, he's a lot stricter than Kirk was, but he still has this really vulnerable human side. But speaking of Kirk, it's just really nice to see William Shatner and James Doohan and Walter Koenig reprise their roles here. It just feels like home. And the character interactions among the TNG cast really feel warm and lived in, which again is important for not alienating me, a new TNG fan. But really the main draw of Star Trek Generations, the thing that they really kind of plastered all over the marketing, was the fact that Picard and Kirk would share the screen for the first time, and seeing them interact really is amazing because their dialogue really comes across as night and day. They couldn't be more different, but they really work well together. And the director here, David Carson, definitely works a lot better with smaller character moments. You know, this entire movie has that mature tone that Wrath of Khan had, that Undiscovered Country had, and that TNG had over TOS, which is something I know. And the first 15 minutes of this movie are just fantastic. It feels like an old school classic Star Trek episode. And the editing in this movie, once again done by Peter E. Berger, really gets great during the starship combat scenes, which are a lot more exciting than anything that TOS ever had to offer. And these battles are genuinely tense because of the first sequence in the movie, which really makes you feel like anyone could go at any point. However, there are a lot of things I found wrong with Star Trek Generations as well. First of all, the pacing really just gets extremely laborious like after the first hour, and becomes really dull and boring for most of it. There's a certain section in the movie where they keep jumping from Picard doing something to the rest of the Enterprise crew doing something, and the jumps between these two things are really awkward. And while David Carson does well with the big starship sequences, the smaller scale action scenes are really cringeworthy. And overall, his direction really comes across as stagey and static in a lot of parts. But really the biggest thing standing in the way of making Star Trek Generations a genuinely good movie is the fact that the story does lack a lot of urgency. You know, by the second hour, you don't really care that much about the villain's big evil plan. There's also a couple of really unnecessary arcs with Data and with Picard. These arcs don't really factor into the main story itself. They never really explain this whole Nexus thing that happens, and it kind of comes across as silly nonsense. And while I do appreciate having Kirk here, I just didn't like how they dealt with the character towards the end, and like I just feel like this whole thing was kind of unnecessary because Undiscovered Country sent off the character a lot better. And as much as I love Malcolm McDowell, like he just really chews the scenery a bit too much here, and he ends up looking really cartoonish and out of place. In the end, Star Trek Generations is really just kind of okay. It's kind of a disappointing first movie for the TNG cast, although it's again not really bad. So those are my quick thoughts on Star Trek Generations. If you guys have seen it, please tell me what you thought about it, and whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.